All right. Yes, you are involved now, Chase. All right. I don't think anybody will begrudge us if we start a tiny bit early. Today I'm going to be the one handling AP review. Mr. Velasco is taking a little bit of a training for proctoring AP exams. On Thursday, on Thursday, he'll be taking over kind of AP review for units 8 and 9. But today we're going to talk about units 6 and 7. This roughly corresponds with our unit 6, our unit 7, our unit 8, and part of unit 9. Unit 7, and the reason why we're separating it out so much, unit 7 covers everything from the Spanish-American War to the Second World War. So we think it's better to kind of separate that out a little bit. All right, let's go ahead and get started today. Unit 6 and Unit 7 are pretty rich areas on the AP. There was a DBQ a couple of years ago from period 6 about American national culture, actually. A lot of the documents had to do with things like immigration, things like the Gilded Age, which is the primary subject of period 6. Now, just like we've been doing, all of you probably, or most of you anyway, have been here for the last couple of sessions, so you know the drill by this point. All right. Let's go ahead and take a look now at the first theme, America and national identity. So, in terms of our first theme, the area that we have to focus on first, actually, is this question of citizenship. Who counts as a citizen in the United States, especially after the Civil War? During the Civil War, of course, it was about slavery, as much as people say it wasn't. It was about slavery. And as such, kind of the idea of what do we do in a post-slavery society is a big question. The New South is what we call the post-Civil War South. It's a time period in which there is this question of, does the South become a different sort of place, or does it retain elements of racism and agricultural identity? And honestly, nothing much happens in the South. The South is more of an example of continuity. Jim Crow laws are going to be reinforced by things like Plessy v. Ferguson. What's the ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson? Yeah. Segregation is A-OK. Separate but equal is the phrase regarding that. Don't take me saying segregation is A-OK out of context. However, there is going to insert laugh here. But, thank you. Anyway, in terms of kind of this pushback against segregation, though, we've got figures like Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, and my favorite, W.E.B. Du Bois. All three of these figures are examples of African Americans fighting for civil rights in this post-Civil War Southern society. Ida B. Wells was a muckraker focused on lynching. Booker T. Washington. Does anybody remember the difference between these two guys, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois? Yeah, Ruby. Exactly. Booker T. Washington was slower in terms of being more moderate when it comes to the issue of civil rights, whereas W.B. Du Bois immediate political rights right now. Anybody remember the name of the organization Mr. Du Bois establishes? Yes. It very much was the NAACP. Excellent. In terms of Native Americans, they are not considered citizens in this time period, but there is movements to assimilate Native Americans. Indian boarding schools is the historic name. We're going to try to, quote unquote, kill the Indian to save the man is the slogan that was given at the time, promoting American values in Native Americans. But speaking about this idea of citizenship and immigration, the Gilded Age is a period of intense nativism, especially towards Chinese immigrants. Why are Chinese immigrants in the United States? To work on things like the Transcontinental Railroad. But in reaction to these Chinese immigrants, we see things like the Chinese Exclusion Act. For example, the name is exactly what it sounds like. Now, we're going to progress ahead. We're going to go ahead and talk about Unit 7. Unit 7 covers everything from the Spanish-American War up to World War II. And kind of the question of citizenship in Unit 7 partially has to do with the legacy of all of those wars. The Spanish-American War set up the United States as an overseas empire. And part of that kind of debates about imperialism include, do we grant citizenship to the people in the colonies? And the answer, because of the insular cases, is no. The insular cases is a series of Supreme Court cases that ultimately are going to say the right of citizenship is not exclusive, it's not inclusive of the people living in the colonies. The progressive era is also happening at this time, and we see that the concept of citizenry is going to start being expanded in the progressive era. The progressive era contained a lot of reformers who wanted to make America a more fair place in terms of political representation. And an example of that is the 17th Amendment, for example. The 17th Amendment, what did it do? It allowed the direct election of senators. Who picked out senators before the 17th Amendment? Did the people vote for them directly? No. Then who chose them? Yeah. State legislatures, exactly. The state governments choose those senators. So, kind of a concept in the progressive era is what we call active citizenry. You're all citizens, you need to participate in your democracy. But speaking of being able to participate in democracy, women are going to get the right to vote in the 19th Amendment. How do you remember the 18th and the 19th Amendment? Yeah. 18 beers, 19 women, the ideal weekend. All right. Swamp fox. All right. But getting back a little bit to this question of citizenship in wars. In wars, we tend to see a trend is that the government takes away basic civil liberties. We saw that in World War I. We see that in World War II. Very dramatically in World War I, we saw Schenck v. U.S. In Schenck v. U.S., it is going to explicitly say that the government has a right to take away First Amendment when there is a clear and present danger. Yes. It enacted prohibition. The 21st Amendment is what repealed it. How old do you have to be to drink? 21 years old. Bless you indeed. All right. What? Who? The 21st Amendment repealed the earlier 18th Amendment. That's the only reason it exists in the Constitution. All right. Anyway, getting back to World War II, Japanese internment, for example. But kind of going ahead a little bit to the 20s. In the 20s, there's the first Red Scare. And kind of that definition of citizenship, it doesn't include political radicals, communists, anarchists. And who are coded as anarchists and communists? Immigrants. We are going to see further restrictions on immigrants in the 1920s, leading to things like the Immigration Quota Acts, for example. Getting a little bit about the wars themselves. In the wars, we saw propaganda promoting basic freedoms in the United States. We are fighting for democracy. We're fighting for improvement to everyday living conditions. That's kind of the propaganda message we're sending out in World War I and World War II. During World War II, for example, FDR gives a speech called the Four Freedoms Speech. And this speech is basically going to say, this is what we're fighting for. We're fighting for things like democracy, freedom of speech, and freedom of conscience. You get to believe whatever the hell you want to. All right. Yes. Certainly I can. The Espionage and Sedition Acts are going to place limitations on radical speech during times of war. Oftentimes, the people criticizing World War I were socialists and left-leaning people. These are going to be kind of heavily restricted and imprisoned during the First World War under the under the Espionage and Sedition Act. Yes. The CIA was developed after World War II, 1947. All right. Brother's not locked in. All right. Anyone else? All right. Work exchange and technology. This is probably my least favorite theme from the AP, but anyway, let's talk about it. In Unit 6 especially, we see new technologies such as the ones included right here. I'm going to talk about the less obvious ones. Combine harvester, really big device that make it easy to harvest many wheat or many corn. So it is going to be a device, I sound like caveman right there. It's going to be a device that is going to allow for rapid farming in the American Midwest, for example. The air brake, it's a brake on trains. Canning, you know what that is. You know what refrigeration is. Barbed wire is important because it allows for kind of areas to be sectioned off for farming. So cattle farming, for example, etc. The Bessemer steel process, it makes steel better. You can almost say it makes steel Bessemer. Oh, thank you. Yeah.
So for the combine harvester,
Yeah.
That being an example of like overproduction of wheat and how like
that is perfect and excellent, and we will talk about it. But yes, that is wonderful, excellent. That leads to the Panic of 1893. Yes, really big thing that make it faster to harvest. All right. Any other questions that aren't about combine harvesters? All right. All right, so in terms of economic development, remember that kind of this economic development is happening during a time of laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, what do we mean by that? Just really quickly, yes. Hands off of the economy, definitely deregulation of the markets, definitely less government presence in the economy, allowing for monopolization. Now, we see that the government is going to have some actions that do support economic development. For example, the Pacific Railway Act is going to be what leads to the development of the Transcontinental Railroad. You're telling me this entire continental railroad is trans. All right, the Homestead Act as well is going to allow for greater migration of people into the Midwest. The Morrill Land Grant Act, that set up colleges and universities like the U of A, for example, which hopefully none of you have to go to. So U of A, things like these types of universities. However, we see that this lack of regulation is largely an abuse of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is supposed to grant equal citizenship to all people. But in Supreme Court cases like the slaughterhouse cases, what the 14th Amendment is used is to establish what is called corporate personhood. Corporations are people, basically. They have the same rights as any other citizen of the United States. Yes.
corporation for people, does that mean they can do like something like they give the death penalty or something?
How would an entire corporation give the death penalty? No, but in turn, it's a little complicated, but no, it does not do that. But it means things like you can do with your property as you see fit. It's your workplace. You can pay your workers whatever you want. You can give them a dime a second or whatever. Yeah.
So, or that would like benefit corporations.
Yeah, basically, the Supreme Court is being abused to protect corporations. Continuity. All right. However, we do see that there are some regulations. There are some regulations on business. There's the Sherman Antitrust Act. The problem is it's not enforced by the government. We see that there's the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. That's also not enforced by the US government. But also this idea of social Darwinism helps justify laissez-faire. Social Darwinism, you've been learning about it for 2 years in a row. What's that real quick? Someone remind me. I have early onset dementia. Yes.
Kind of like scientific, pseudoscientific viewing of races.
Yeah. It's pseudoscientific viewing of race and class as well. Poor people should be poor because they are not the fittest, basically. Survival of the fittest. But speaking to something that will become more important later, gold standard. The gold standard is going to deflate the American economy by pulling out paper money. During the Civil War, the US government published paper money, which caused inflation. Post-Civil War, we see the gold standard. This will lead to problems later. All right. New business practices that are happening. There's monopolies, for example. One example is Cornelius Vanderbilt. You should know some of these names. Cornelius Vanderbilt is a railroad industry titan, and he's going to pioneer the idea of mergers and company monopolization. That's the big thing right there. We've also got Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Someone remind me, what is the difference between vertical and horizontal integration? Yes.
So vertical, okay, we're gonna control all the parts of production. From
No.
mining.
No. So vertical integration is the idea of controlling one step in the manufacturing process. In the case of Mr. Carnegie, he is controlling the things like. This is why I don't teach this unit. So vertical integration is what my Sam said. Oh my God, I am so sorry, my friend. All right, so it is the idea of controlling the coal, of controlling the iron, of controlling the steel mills. So you control all steps of production. Whereas horizontal integration is controlling what I said earlier, one specific step in the process. So in the case of Rockefeller, he's controlling the refinement of oil. That's what a horizontal integration is. JP Morgan as well, he's related to this idea of kind of cutting costs by firing and consolidating things. That's what we call Morganization. But who actually works in the factories? Mostly immigrants. These immigrants tend to come from Eastern and Southern Europe, or they are Chinese immigrants. Those are the different immigrants of the post-Civil War period. All right. Any questions right now? No? You're all good? Cool beans. All right. Getting back to Unit 6 a little bit, just a couple of other things. We see kind of that one of the things you should understand for historical complexity is understanding that the Gilded Age wasn't all that bad in terms of the idea of production and in terms of things like resource production. There are positive effects. Generally, we see what we call improved standards of living. As we produce more, we're seeing that there are more stuff to buy in the American public. There's things like Sears and Roebuck. That's like a ye old mail catalog, basically. It's the Amazon of the 1800s. But also we see that the price of manufactured goods goes down as production goes up. The problem with the Gilded Age is what you did last year with the worker simulation in both Euro and in World. We saw that there was very lax enforcement of regulations in workplaces. There's abuse, there's child labor, all of these horrible things. But in response to these terrible things, we've got labor unions. Well, I want you to talk to your neighbor. What is the difference between the Knights of Labor and the AFL? Talk to your neighbor. What's the difference between these two things? That's it. They're okay with women. They're okay with unskilled. What? The Knights of Labor. All right. They're over here. They're over here. Those are World over there. So the Knights. Knights of Labor, they are going to be, who are the Knights of Labor? Who are those guys? Yes, read. No. Yes.
They are unskilled laborers.
Unskilled laborers, they are more inclusive, except for Chinese immigrants. All right, what about the AFL then? What's their restrictions? Yes. More specialized, more skilled labor. Excellent, excellent. All right. Any questions so far? All right. Let's move on ahead to Unit 7. Unit 7 is about work imperialism. It's about foreign interactions. But let's talk about a little bit of the idea of trade. One of the reasons why we became an overseas empire was the desire for natural resources. We wanted sugar from Hawaii, for example. We wanted pineapples from the Pacific Ocean. We wanted as well access to a Panama Canal, for example. So kind of the desire for resources and trading opportunities is what led to imperialism. But we also see that during this kind of early 20th century, it's the so-called progressive era. It's basically the opposite of laissez-faire. Rather than laissez-faire, we do see that some presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, to name two, they are going to engage in regulation of the economy. We have various acts that could be used as evidence to support that. Meat inspection, Clayton Antitrust Act, Federal Reserve. But kind of you're seeing that in American history, things sway one way to the other. In the progressive era, there's heavy regulation of the economy. But by the time you get to the 1920s, laissez-faire comes back in a roaring, booming way in the 1920s. Then you get to the New Deal, and there is this regulation as a result of the Great Depression. That's kind of the big thing to understand is swings in terms of government regulation of the economy. But speaking of the 1920s for a second, in the 1920s, there is rapid development of production. For example, we have the assembly line. What kind of industrialist pioneered the assembly line? Yes, Mr. Henry Ford, exactly. There's the idea of scientific management, doing little things to improve productivity. But we also have kind of the general effect of these things is that it decreases the production costs and therefore reduces prices of goods. But what are people buying? They're buying the new latest communication technology. Things like radios, things like going to the movies, for example, things like telephones. And kind of a result of things like radios and film is going to be the rise of a national culture. Jazz, for example. Does anybody remember what the jazz singer was? Yeah. It was the first movie with synchronized sound. Excellent. I know I put as right there. That was a mistake. Should I? No, never mind. It's being recorded. All right. So, Great Depression. Great Depression. What's the deal with that? So you kind of do need to know a little bit about the Great Depression, what caused it, and the government reaction to it. The Great Depression was caused by a variety of factors. Things like buying on margin, for example. Someone remind me real quick, what's buying on margin? Yes, or Jenny.
It's basically using money that you don't have. So what you're doing is you're asking for a loan to invest in stocks, hoping and basically bargaining the fact that you're going to make that profit to pay back those stocks.
Exactly. The problem is the stock market go crash one day. No one can pay back their loans. Banks are going to go out of business. And when banks go out of business, there's no savings anymore. People lose their savings and they can't afford housing, for example. So isolationism, overproduction, all of these things cause the Great Depression. Guess what? We've got FDR. FDR comes around and begins the New Deal. Now, what the New Deal does is two things. It is going to regulate the economy to prevent another depression, and it's also going to provide welfare services, things like unemployment insurance. But the thing I want to focus on is intervention and regulation of the economy. Glass-Steagall, for example, is going to be what bans what becomes buying on margin. FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, your deposits in banks are protected in the event that that bank goes under. But you love unions so much, guess what? We've got the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act is going to provide the legality of labor unions in the United States. But ultimately, the thing that ends the Great Depression is not the New Deal, but World War II. Our production of military stuff is going to be what allows for the end of the Great Depression. Really quickly, what is the number one issue of the Great Depression? The one kind of major problem facing the United States, probably the most important. Unemployment, exactly, great. Wars lead to technological advancement. But before we do that, yeah. Glass-Steagall is going to prevent banks from using depositors' money in the stock market. It kind of prevents that association between over-speculation and the failing of the banking industry. Yes.
Wait, banks using other, like the opposite of what we were talking about earlier,
Hey.
people spending banks' money.
So a loan is bank's money. So kind of getting a loan to invest in the stock market, that's what's going to be banned. Yeah. Lend-lease is the system where the Americans, they produce military goods for our allies in World War II, the British, the Chinese, the Soviet Union. All right. Any questions about that? All right. Wars lead to technological advancement, but you kind of know these already. Manhattan Project, what did that do real quick? The bomb, the atomic bomb, exactly, the big boy. All right. The fat man, as it's called. All right. And the little boy, too. All right. Any questions about these? Any questions? Yes.
Blood transfusions.
Blood transfusions were invented in World War II by an African-American man, actually.
Made it seem like they also invented blood
No, the Manhattan Project did not invent blood transfusions. All right. I don't know. All right. Any questions that don't infuriate me? You are all locked out. All right. Shh. Geography. Guys, this is only going to work if you shut up. So, geography. What's going on with the geography during this time? Luckily, there's not much to talk about. Post-Civil War, where do people move to? To the worst parts of the country, the West. All of this right here is going to become settled thanks to the Homestead Act, thank you, and the Transcontinental Railroad. Exactly. These two things are going to provide for massive immigration to the West. But we're drawn to the West not just because of farmland, but also about things like gold and silver, the Comstock lode in Nevada, for example. There's a lot of silver. I wonder if that leads to political tensions in the future. Silver, excellent. All right. But we also see that as people are going to settle in the West, that there is going to be kind of an environmental risk of all of this. Bonanza farming is massive commercialized farming. You kind of learned about that in human geo, ideally, and in the other one, environmental science. So bonanza farming is going to lead to overproduction, which wonderful William reminded us about, which is going to lead to things like the Panic of 1893. But kind of all of these economic and environmental problems, they help explain why the Populist Party emerges in the late 1800s. The Populist Party is going to try and represent the economic concerns of the farmers in this country. Do you know when factories are built, there's pollution? That's true, yes. 1893, 93. All right, that's the populist one right there. All right, any questions so far? All right, Unit 7. Why do we do imperialism? Resources, sugar, pineapple, rubber, all of these things contribute to overseas expansion. But kind of something that's unique to Unit 7 is that eventually progressives in Washington, they're going to see that our over-farming, our deforestation is causing negative effects on the natural environment. This is where we start to see trends towards environmental protection. Probably the biggest political leader in favor of environmental protection is our boy, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is going to set up national parks, but kind of these are other examples of progressive environmentalists. Guys like the Sierra Club, John Muir. This is also the context of the Pinchot-Ballinger affair.
What in charge of like these things?
He's kind of the intellectual granddaddy of of national parks, basically. Yeah, no? Okay. Any other questions? Yes, Dave.
What was the Ballinger affair?
Fine, I'll go into it. So, in this affair, this is kind of what you were referencing. It's going to be this debate between Taft, who picks out this guy, Ballinger, to lead the Secretary of the Interior. But he's going to fire a guy that Roosevelt hired named Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was your super hippy-dippy environmentalist. But since Taft is going to fire him using Ballinger, it kind of causes a split in the Republican Party. So the Republican Party splits up between progressives who support environmentalism and more traditional laissez-faire guys that kind of ally with Taft mostly. All right. Any other questions? Good questions so far. All right. And bad questions. Yeah, Juan. The Sierra, it's an environmentalist organization. We should have national parks in the Sierra Mountains, for example. All right. 1920s, where do we live? We live in the suburbs. We live in the suburbs because guess what? We have access to automobiles. Vroom, vroom, beep, beep, automobiles are going to be what allow for suburbanization, a change in the human environment, if you will. But guess what? You like conservation? There's going to be a whole New Deal organization devoted to conservation. Who remembers the CCC? What does that stand for? Yes. Civilian Conservation Corps. It continues the progressive interest in environmentalism. Excellent. Yeah, we've already done that. Any questions so far? I know I'm going fast, but I hate my life. All right, any questions? What? Yes. Conservation Corps, CORPS. No, you don't pronounce the P in core. Okay. No, whatever. All right. William. When Mr. Velasco is not here, you guys go crazy for some reason. All right. Any questions? All right. Migration and settlement. Let's talk about migration and settlement. The Transcontinental Railroad brings people to the West. Guess what? Chugga chugga choo choo device make people move to the West. What? I am locked in. You're locked out. Okay. Transcontinental Railroad. It brings people to the West. Who works on the Transcontinental Railroad? Chinese people. All right, let us center ourselves. Okay. Homestead Act also compels people to go out west. Anybody need clarification about the Homestead Act? You all remember the Homestead Act? For $15 for a registration fee, you get 100 acres of land as long as you work on it. Yes. They did actually. Yes. My great-great-grandmother is an example of that. All right. Just a little feminist icon. All right. Exodusters. All right, let's talk about them for a second. The Exodusters, they're a specific group of people who move out to the West. Specifically, they are African Americans. They're escaping things like Jim Crow segregation for opportunities out west over here where there is, well, less segregation. So there's the Exodusters. They're an example of migration because of racism, because of racial discrimination in the South. All right. New immigrants. Do I need to say who are the new immigrants? Yeah. No, I don't. Chinese, Southern, and Eastern Europeans. All right. Where do immigrants work? They work in factories and on transportation projects like the Transcontinental. In response. Okay, we need to get through this. In response, Chinese Exclusion Act. What are ethnic enclaves? Does anybody need to know what an ethnic enclave is? Okay, you all know what that is? An ethnic enclave is a special location where immigrants tend to congregate. An example is Chinatown. All right. Any questions? Yes.
So I hope everyone just like because their loans they have to get so many loans.
Exactly. The land is free, but the cost to actually work on that, it makes them hella broke, as Oswaldo reminded us. All right. Any other questions? What's the other problem with the Homestead Act? Anybody remember that? What's the problem? How did railroad companies abuse the Homestead Act? Yes.
Violent land
Exactly, or jack up the prices. And who would buy that? The railroad companies themselves. These railroads, I hope somebody wants to regulate them. More on that in a second. All right. Migration and settlement in period 7. Interestingly enough, immigration is going to happen not just to the United States, but within the United States. We see that kind of in terms of external immigration. What motivated restrictions on immigrants? Things like the Red Scare, things like social Darwinism, things like the KKK, for example. Remember, the KKK in the 1920s is not just racist against Black people. It's racist against immigrants, Catholics, and Jews, in addition to communists as well. Not that you can be racist to communists, but kind of this heightened political disagreement right there. Another event that kind of compels external immigration is the Mexican Revolution. This is where groups like Hispanic immigrants start to come into the United States. But within the United States, we see things like the Great Migration. The Great Migration describes, of course, the migration of Black people from the South into northern urban centers. Why are Black people going to these urban northern centers, you might ask? World War I. In World War I, there is a factory labor shortage. In order to make sure there's enough workers, this is where migration is going to happen. Yes? There was actually. African Americans did participate in the military, mostly out of this desire to kind of gain equal status to white people. All right, any other questions so far? All right. However, as people, Harlem. Harlem is probably the biggest kind of example of where Black people are congregating in northern urban centers. And this has an effect on things like creating the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance is going to be this explosion of jazz and culture, etc., in the 1920s among the African American community. Where do people live? In suburbs. We've already talked about that. In World War II as well, we are going to see immigration patterns with the Bracero program. What was the point of the Bracero program? What were these Mexican laborers used for? Yes. Exactly, mostly farm labor. The problem is these farm laborers not equally treated as native citizens of the United States. But of course, speaking of nativism, in World War II, we are going to see anti-Japanese discrimination in the form of internment camps. All right. Any questions thus far, dear brothers and sisters? Yes.
What was the Red Summer?
Red Summer describes the summer of 1919, in which there will be over thousands of anti-Black riots all across the United States, but mostly in northern urban centers. So like Chicago, like with the Tulsa Race Massacre, for example. All right. Any other questions? The Tulsa, 1919. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. No. Let's talk about politics. Third-party system, politics doesn't matter because laissez-faire. Laissez-faire, we didn't talk about any presidents in the Gilded Age because none of them matter. Presidents like Garfield, who the hell is he? So presidents don't really matter during this time. However, we do see that kind of a big trend in the United States is that in this environment of laissez-faire, there is political corruption. We see that people are taking advantage of the spoils system, for example. In response to this kind of corruption, we see the Pendleton Act, which created the civil service exam in the United States. World student, remind me, what's the civil service exam? Yes.
I know we want Confucianist people to go in government.
You have to take a test to be a government worker. Exactly. That's what the Pendleton Act does. But we see that there are examples of corruption all the way from the municipal to the government level. The ICC was staffed with railroad dudes, Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed. What city are these two institutions from again? The greatest city in the world? New York City, exactly. So Boss Tweed, Tammany Hall, this represents kind of corruption at the local municipal level. In terms of kind of the politics, honestly, it doesn't matter all that much. The Democrats, mostly in the South, Republicans, mostly in the North. But Republicans generally control the federal government ever since the end of Reconstruction. the Compromise of 1877 basically allowed for the Republicans to dominate the federal government, and Democrats got to keep the South and all that racism. However, the big area of controversy is going to start happening by the time of the Panic of 1893. This is when we're going to see political realignment and the Populist Party. The Populist Party, remember, is going to try and represent the concerns of farmers. There's overproduction, environmental disasters, but also there's the issue concerning gold and silver. Why did the Populist Party want silver as the basis of the American currency? Wesley.
To inflate currency.
Exactly. Inflate currency, which would inflate prices, which would make it easier for farmers to pay off their high interest rate loans. Exactly. William Jennings Bryan is probably the man to associate this with the idea of political realignment, because Jennings Bryan is going to combine the interests of the Populist Party and the Democratic Party. These two parties merge, and the issues of the populists become the issues of the Democratic Party. Yes.
Were loans, were the loans given to them, were they not being adjusted for inflation, or were they just
So those loans tended to stay at a set amount.
Oh.
So it's easier to pay that back if it's worth less in the future. Yes. Panic. It was a major economic depression that had to do with over speculation in the stock market, and it had to do with environmental disasters. All right, that's generally what that was. Like, the one president to know from Unit 6 is William McKinley. William McKinley supported the gold standard and imperialism overseas. 1896 is probably the most important election because it represents those tensions between farmers and urban industrialists. All right. What's the famous speech that Jennings Bryan gives? Yeah. Cross gold, exactly. Any questions? Yes. The election of 1896 was about the gold standard. It was between the populists, aka the Democratic Party, and the Republicans. It was about gold and silver. McKinley wins. All right. Any questions? All right. Fourth party system in the early 1900s. The issues are, do we get involved in overseas, or do we have government regulation of the economy? And you can think about the period between 1900 and 1920 as this debate between progressives and those in favor of laissez-faire. The term progressive is not explicitly to one political party. There are progressive Republicans in this time. There are progressive Democrats at this time. But the difference is government intervention in the economy versus no government intervention in the economy. And we see that in both of the political parties. Laissez-faire Republicans like McKinley, they butted heads against progressive presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and Howard Taft, for example. There's this debate over how we regulate the economy. Do we allow for monopolies? Do we get all of them out completely? There's debates over foreign intervention and isolation as well. Roosevelt, the progressive imperialist, Henry Cabot Lodge, the isolationist. Henry Cabot Lodge especially was opposed to the U.S. joining what institution after World War I? The League of Nations, exactly. Indeed. In the Democratic Party, there's also debates concerning things like laissez-faire versus progressives. Wilson is the best example of a progressive Democrat. Wilson is going to be against monopolies in all forms, but he's also opposed to imperialism, at least in theory. All right. 1920, though, we get back to laissez-faire Republicans. Harding, he is going to become president in 1920. We're back to, quote unquote, normalcy. This return to laissez-faire principles that we saw in the pre-progressive era. All right. Any questions right now? Again, I know I'm going fast, but I want to get... All right, any questions? All righty then. But then you get to the Great Depression. The Great Depression lasts between 1929 and 1945, and largely it's what compels the rise of the Democratic Party under Franklin D. Roosevelt. We're going to see that Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s is going to set up this principle of intervention in the economy. We see new organizations like the CCC, which we've talked about. We see things like the AAA as well. However, the New Deal honestly doesn't go that far when it comes to things like taxing the wealthy, for example. And some people would criticize FDR for being too liberal capitalisty, like Huey Long, for example. Huey Long, he was the governor of Louisiana, exactly. He is going to say, we need to, quote, share our wealth. Yes. 1936, doesn't matter. However, we also see that there is pushback against the New Deal by the Supreme Court in Schechter v. U.S. Schechter v. U.S. is going to strike down parts of the New Deal, which are viewed as anti-capitalist, like the National Recovery Administration. So the Supreme Court is opposed to the New Deal, but there's also pressure from radicals like Mr. Long. Yeah. That is indeed the sick chicken case. So to study that. All right. However, the most important effect of the New Deal is not just government regulation of the economy. It's going to be the creation of the New Deal Coalition between 1932 and 1968. We're going to see that different groups of people vote for the Democratic Party. Who makes up the New Deal Coalition? Jenny. African Americans. They benefit from programs like the CCC. Yes. Urban workers, especially labor unions, and who else? One other group of people.
Immigrants.
Yeah, immigrants too. That's not the one I was thinking of. Now, immigrants is right. Immigrants is right. But there's another more important group of people. White farmers in the South, especially. No, immigrants is right, but white Southerners are more. For your AP knowledge, it's more important you understand that white Southerners voted for the Democratic Party. Obviously, I hate white Southerners. You sat through my Civil War unit. You know I hate white Southerners. Civil War, doctor, baby. All right. Elections to know. 1912, Republicans are split between progressives and laissez-faire types. 1920, we're back to laissez-faire, baby. 1928, racism in elections. Anybody remember Al Smith? What was his problem? Al Smith? He seemed like a good guy, right? Yeah. He was corrupt, but there are even worse things about him. Yeah. Catholic. He was Catholic. He was also the son of immigrants as well. So 1928 kind of represents these divides over things like immigration, things like radicalism as well. 1932, FDR gets elected. Begins the New Deal Coalition. All right. Presidents you should know: Teddy Roosevelt, Wilson, Calvin Coolidge, FDR. Coolidge, he just represents the 20s in how it was very laissez-faire. He didn't do anything, but that was the point. All right. All right. Any questions? Yes. My skincare routine is moving on. All right. So, foreign policy in the late 19th century, it doesn't freaking matter because guess what? In the period after the Civil War, guess what we are? Relatively isolationist. There's some exceptions to this, though. You could almost say this is historical complexity, but we do see that there is some examples of Americans getting involved overseas. 1867, we buy Alaska. But we also start to see American presence in Hawaii, for example. We're going to see that wars with Native Americans are happening at this time. Some examples include the Wounded Knee Massacre, the battle at Little Big Horn, for example. But honestly, not much happens in foreign policy in the Gilded Age. That changes by the time we get to 1898. Spanish-American War, we are going to fight it for access to empire in the Pacific Ocean and in the Caribbean as well. Let's say it all together. The cause of the Spanish-American War, remember the Maine. To hell with Spain. Exactly. All right. However, we do see that after the Spanish-American War, there is going to be this trend of intervention in Latin America. This is where the different foreign policies we talked about with Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson come into play. We've got our boy, Roosevelt, with the big stick policy. They're going to act like the world's policeman, basically, wielding our power as a policeman waves his nightstick around. It's because of the big stick policy that we get things like the Panama Canal, for example, our intervention in that country. Taft, dollar diplomacy. Who remembers what dollar diplomacy is real quick? What is dollar diplomacy? Yeah, Addie. Exactly. Taft is going to say, hey, businesses, go invest in Latin America. United Fruit Company, go invest in Latin America. And then missionary diplomacy, we are only going to respect democratic governments in Latin America. Yes.
Would dollar diplomacy be an example of like informal imperialism?
It would indeed be a good example of that. Yes. The United Fruit Company, yeah. Yeah, in Guatemala during the Cold War. Precisely, yes. Yes, it was done by Woodrow Wilson. Excellent. All right. Any other questions about our boys? All right. What's the big issue between 1917 and 1919? World War I. Why do we get involved in World War I? What are some reasons for our involvement in that stupid conflict? Yeah. Lusitania got sunk. What else? Boop, 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 boop. Yeah. Unrestricted submarine warfare. One last one I can think of. Yeah. Marquise. The Zimmerman telegram. Hey, guys, let's invade Mexico. Oh, wait, no. Mexico, go invade the United States. Yeah, exactly. That's earlier in history. All right. All right. World War I. World War I, we saw that there's the idea of total war. Total war, of course, is things like propaganda, rationing. But guess what? Women, you get to work in factories. Women, you get to be a part of the war effort and help us out win this conflict against the godless Germans. All right. The Hun, exactly. Yeah. All right. The Hun. No. No, yes. Well, any questions that don't concern my hair? Yes.
Oh my gosh. No one cares.
All right. World War I. What's the big debate about after that? Do we join the League of Nations? No, we don't join the League of Nations. There is going to be a trend of isolationism. Why is there isolationism? Because of these debates about Republicans. Some Republicans are in favor of not being involved in the League of Nations at all. They are the so-called irreconcilables. But some people are like, maybe if we compromise. This is where Wilson doesn't compromise and we don't join the League of Nations. All right. In the 1920s, how do we define our foreign policy? One word, isolationism. How do we define that? Through things like tariffs, things like nativism. Who remembers the good neighbor policy? What's kind of that good neighbor policy real quick, Joy? We're not going to do anything in Latin America. Exactly. However, kind of the big issue is going to be World War II in the 1940s. Even before World War II, we're already gearing up to go to war. We're doing things like a peacetime draft. We're doing things like propaganda. We're doing the Lend-Lease Act to help the British, to help the Soviets, to help the Chinese. Excellent. What's the event that leads us into World War II? A single event that lives in infamy? Pearl Harbor, yeah. No, I'm not going to do that. All right, so Pearl Harbor is what leads us into World War II. All right. After World War II, though, we're going to see the seeds of the Cold War being planted in the so-called Yalta Conference. Study that. All right. Any questions? No, I hate you. Yeah, any other questions? All right, maybe we can turn off the air. All right, regional identity, immigrants. We've already talked about them. They've come from Eastern and Southern Europe and China. However, kind of where they go is important. Immigrants tend to always go to New England, the Northeast, I should say, and Western states. But we do see kind of there are some issues revolving where people live in terms of politics. Rural parts of the country, these tend to be more conservative. We tend to see that there is a lot of idea of Southern regionalism, of Western regionalism. So there is this kind of urban-rural divide going on in the late 19th century that helps explain things like the emergence of the populist party. The term Solid South you might see on the AP, and what it means is the South has always traditionally voted for Democrats. This is going to end in 1968, but more on that later. All right. So cultural divides between urban and rural society. In urban places, we've got department stores. We've got immigrants. But in the rural parts of the world, we see kind of yeoman farmers, religious sort of things. So that's always been a historic divide in the US. This division over religion reflects urban and rural parts of the country. All right. Any questions? No. Nine, as they say in German. All right. Wunderbar, yes. 1920s. In the 1920s, we see the development of a national culture thanks to new communication technology. We see things like jazz and radio and film and sports, all of these wonderful things. This is when the flappers start to emerge in the United States. Those smoking women. All right. So, all right. Because they were smoking was seen as a symbol of the liberated woman, as it is in the present. No, just kidding. Don't smoke. Don't smoke anything. Don't smoke tobacco. Don't smoke crack. Don't smoke anything like that. All right. What? Tobacco and crack? No, there isn't. You start with Pokemon cards. The next thing you're doing is you're worshiping Satan. So like it's a thing like that. However, the one thing that we haven't talked about yet is this divide between rural and urban society. A symbol of this rural-urban divide in the 1920s is the monkey trial, the Scopes monkey trial. That was about, of course, evolution. Evolution, that's kind of the major controversy of the 1920s. But guess what? There's the KKK as well. All right. No. All right. Yes, indeed. Birth of the Nation was a very popular film that represented this renewed interest in the KKK. Exactly. However, yeah, sorry, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Monkey trial at first it gets like you're dumb, and then it gets repealed. It's like no, actually you're right.
Yeah. So at first, kind of the whole issue is like, wow, he did break the law, but on appeal, eventually they overturn that conviction. He's fined like $10 or something. Yeah.
Birth of the Nation, the first film shown in the White House.
It was indeed the first film shown in the White House. All right. Any other questions? Those are all good questions. All right. However, not everybody agreed with this kind of conformist nature of the 1920s. For example, we saw authors like Sinclair Lewis and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, these two authors, they are a part of a wider literary movement. Anybody remember what that's called? Yeah. The Lost Generation. You could almost compare the Lost Generation to the Beat Generation of the 1950s after World War II. All right. Any questions? Again, a lot of stuff, a lot of content, but are there any things you want to go over a little bit more? Yes? No? Okay. This is the last one. Let's go. No, social structures. All right. Racism, sexism, and classism. These are all things in American history. So, Jim Crow segregation, forced assimilation of Native Americans. Anybody remember what the Dawes Severalty Act did real quick? Someone remind me of that. Yes, Reed.
Land, something.
Mhm.
Like encourage assimilation.
Exactly. It is going to break up reservation land that was communally owned and divide it into individual plots. This is an attempt to assimilate Native Americans into Western ideas of property ownership and Western economic relationships. Excellent. But we also see class divides. Poor people are poor. They're living in slums. They're living in tenements, for example. These tenements are very run-down apartments in urban centers. We've got children working. Yay, children working. Their limbs are getting cut off and fed into sausage machines, for example. Yes, back when this was a real country. No. So, middle class is also developing at the same time, though. That's something important to understand. We see that people are employed in what we would call white-collar labor. This is things like management, things like educated job positions, lawyers, department store owners, for example. And kind of the reason why this middle class is developing is because of greater access to colleges, thanks to those land grant colleges we discussed earlier, but also generally the wealth produced by the Second Industrial Revolution. What are these dumb rich people spending their money on? Leisure culture. Who remembers what leisure culture is from World last year? Yeah. Exactly. You have time to spend on free time hobbies. What are rich people doing during this time? They're going to opera houses. They're watching vaudeville. They're watching kind of these acts on Broadway, for example. All right. However, not all these rich people are just sitting on their bums all day watching operas, but they're doing stuff like the social gospel, for example, and they're engaged in philanthropy. Does anybody, actually, really quick, talk to your neighbor. What is the difference between the social gospel and the gospel of wealth? Go ahead, talk to your neighbor real quick. What's the difference? Yeah. They are related, but kind of the social gospel, that's the idea that it is your Protestant duty to do charity. Whereas it's your duty as a rich person to help other people get a hand.
It's basically just.
All right. Yes, Angel. Yeah, so more so that you're a very good definition for the social gospel, but for the gospel of wealth, it's more so of we're going to fund libraries, give opportunities for that social advancement. Yes. Exactly. Yeah, they should be giving out their money in the form of these institutions like libraries. That's an excellent memory. Who's the guy that we're talking about, though? Carnegie, exactly. What? It's Carnegie. Yeah, you say it Carnegie. You can say it Carnegie or Carnegie. Yeah. How the other half lives. Who wrote that? Or who photographed that, I should say. Yeah. Jacob Rees. Thank you for not saying Jacob Riz. All right. Labor movements. Eugene V. Debs. He was a socialist. He was a guy involved in the labor movement. We've talked about those things. Carrie Nation. Anybody remember Carrie Nation? What was his deal? Or her deal, I should say. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. She's going to smash up bars. This representation of prohibition. Why is prohibition kind of considered a progressive social movement? I love alcohol. Why do we want to ban that stuff? Yeah.
It's done to quote unquote better morality.
Yeah, exactly. You get drunk, you commit sin. You commit sin, you lose your job. You start doing horrible things. Any other things? Yeah. Oh my gosh, those Irish, those Germans, oh, they're drinking all the time. Oh my God. Yeah.
Like not letting people do what they want, so now people have like restrictions of just being able to drink alcohol.
Yeah, we're going to improve society through moral regulation. Excellent. I wonder if there's another political movement all about that after the 1980s. Whoa, excellent. Okay. Women, they're going to form suffragette movements, for example. And we've kind of talked about that. Susan B. Anthony, Alice Paul are two examples. Alice Paul was really radical. She was very much an aggressive feminist in terms of getting women the right to vote. Any questions? Yes. Niagara Movement is what becomes the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. W.E.B. Du Bois is a major component of that. Is that where you're gonna?
Oh, no, I wasn't. I was gonna say you mentioned the immigrants earlier, you forgot the Italians.
Oh my God, I forgot the Italians. All right, yeah.
Well, everyone.
What? Sorry. That would not work in this time period because that happened in 1848. But the ideas of the Seneca Falls Convention carry on in this period as well. She was really long, or she lived a long, she lived a long time. She lived a long time. No, don't quote that on the AP. Oh my God, we're almost done, people. So, movements for social change. The progressive era kind of sucked in a way because guess what? It was mostly a middle-class white people thing. It was exclusionary towards socialists, exclusionary towards non-white people is what I meant to say. African Americans and rural areas. Progressives boo when it comes to the countryside. World War I, immigrants, African Americans and women. We need them in the factories. We're going to bring them into the North. You get rights. Right. Racism, 19th Amendment, 18th Amendment. Flappers. Women are going to start gaining the rights to vote, for example, in the 1920s. But there's also another woman that I didn't put up here. Oh, I did put her up here, never mind. Margaret Sanger. What was Margaret Sanger's big deal? What was Maggie Sanger's big deal? No, that's Dorothea Dix. Yeah. Pro-abortion, or more so, I should say, reproductive health care. She helps found what becomes Planned Parenthood. Exactly. She was definitely racist. She was a eugenicist. She thought that certain people should get abortions. All right.
Bruh.
What?
Bruh.
No.
Sorry, keep going.
No.
We're almost done, people. We've done all of this. We've done all of this already. We've done all of this. We've done all of this. Oh my God.
Talk about it again.
No. Okay. No. All right. Japanese internment sucks. Shh. The things that we didn't talk about, though. Core. Congress on racial equality. It is established during World War II as a kind of way to leverage FDR's government to enact some anti-discrimination laws. One of the biggest leaders of CORE is A. Philip Randolph. He is going to be an activist who pressures Mr. Roosevelt to actually desegregate the federal government. Zoot Suit Riots. What was that about? Zoot Suit Riots. Riot. Exactly. Mexican-American activism. All right. Any questions? No. All right. Thank you guys so much for being here today. God bless all of you. All right. I don't know.